My guest today is Professor Angus Fletcher, who's Professor of Story Science at Ohio State University's Project Narrative for the study of how stories work. His most recent book is Primal Intelligence. You are smarter than you know. Welcome, Angus.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, Gill.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. Yeah, you're smarter than you know. I always thought I was much smarter than I thought I knew. So I want to touch on this a little bit later, actually. So humans have a bias. Machines sort of with prescribed objectives may have less so. I'm not sure about that. I'm making a speculation here. And humans always have sort of positive bias in the sense that they always think very highly about themselves. Obviously, we have a right to do so because 100,000 years we are here. Um, but then machines are very programmatic. They need data and perhaps less biased in that way. So I want to start with computers and then we'll go into humans. So as I mentioned, Angus, I've been doing some work in the AI arena for about 40 years. I still don't know what people mean by artificial intelligence. I've been seeking a definition, but I fail to get there. I would rather call it IA, intelligent automation, and that has been with us from the advent of computers. And so that is sort of very understandable engineering logical construct. Whereas artificial intelligence is very, very difficult to put a definition to. So I want to start with one of your papers. Why computers will never read or write literature, a logical proof and a narrative. So you say here in response to Franco Moretti's project of distant reading and other recent developments in the digital humanities, this article offers a proof that computers will never learn to read or write literature. Yeah, so talk a little bit about this proof. I see three different parts to it. Talk a bit about it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for being willing to go down this road because a lot of people just think I'm nuts when I say that computers can't read or write literature. Because they say, haven't you seen ChatGPT 4 or as of a couple of days ago, ChatGPT 5? I mean,
Five.
haven't you
Yeah.
read Claude or any of these things? And
Yeah.
so I think it's important that we start on a kind of technical level about what literature is.
Yeah.
And for most of the 20th century, literature has been confused with language. And this confusion
Hmm.
is understandable for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, the word literature literally means that which is writ, and so we tend to associate literature with things that have been written.
Hmm.
But the confusion of literature and language really takes root in the early 20th century with a movement known as New Criticism, which comes out of the work of I.A. Richards. And there becomes this equation of language
Hmm.
with novels and language with poems and language with plays. And
Hmm.
from that, there follows the idea that if you can interpret the words on the page, that you can
Yeah.
establish the meaning of the text, and if the text you have isn't enough, then you need to have more text, which is known as context, which is other books. And you
Hmm.
keep kind of increasing your library until finally you can establish certainty about what the words mean. And you can do this by
Hmm.
parsing, different reference and so on and so forth. And I.A. Richards talks about this in a book called The Meaning of Meaning, came out over 100 years ago now. Um, and so that's been the kind of dominant paradigm for understanding what literature is for most of the 20th century. And you might
Hmm.
say, oh, and I should also say in that book, I. Richards also predicts the existence of automated machines, which of course are computers, which will
Hmm.
interpret literature and
Yeah.
produce all the best literature. So almost all of these ways we have about thinking about LLMs now date about 100 years ago to the sort of translation of semiotics into mainstream literary criticism. And you might say, well,
Hmm.
Angus, what's wrong with this? And what I will say is I'm not the first person to point out that there's a problem with this. The first people to point out there was a problem with this were a group of literary critics known as the
Yeah.
Chicago School, who emerged in the 1950s.
Hmm.
And they pointed out that narrative is not the same as language.
Hmm.
Narrative is not the same as language. And I think we can all agree that narrative is a component of literature. Things happen in literature. And
Yeah.
therefore, if literature contains both narrative and language,
Yeah.
then even though LLMs and logic and
Hmm.
semiotics can handle the language part, they can't handle the narrative part. Now, There's a lot of disagreement over this.
Mm.
The Chicago School have existed as kind of a fringe part of the academy, really for the last 70 years.
Yeah, the Chicago school always has been a fringe. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm kind of, in a way, part of that fringe, although also not. So my background, I should say, is in neuroscience. It's in neurophysiology. And I actually became interested in the Chicago School because I came from a different direction and encountered a lot of the problems that I think the Chicago School had. And so just to talk very basically about what we mean by
Mm.
narrative is a series of events.
Yeah.
It's a series of events.
So let me ask you this, Angus. So yeah, so I find this really interesting. I haven't really thought about this. So I don't have deep thoughts on this. But so what you say is language and literature are two different things. Language and narrative are two different things. And I remember you talking about this. I don't know, one of the papers we might discuss that language is a tool in some ways. So I think you called it sort of a way to remember things. So it's sort of a notebook where you can write things down, and then when you read that back, yeah, it's like you're playing a movie in your brain that the language doesn't have anything to do with. I mean, it's just a little notebook of sorts, right? Is that the way
Yeah.
you think about it? Yeah.
Yeah, so if you think anthropologically about the emergence of language, essentially we think it actually started as a way of merchants and other people to record transactions. It started as a way for kings
Mm.
to record truces. It definitely started as a way of sort of successful conquerors to write down what they had successfully conquered so that they could
Yes.
tell everyone how famous and successful they were. So language, in other words, is a memorial tool. It's a way to prompt in human brains a memory,
Mm.
usually of an event or an occurrence. And what that
Mm.
means is that it has to be effective at prompting that memory in human brains. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it contains all the information itself. It means that
Yeah.
it's a prompt. And where
Yeah.
this becomes important is we know that there are different parts of language, and in particular, there are nouns, there are adjectives, and there are
Mm.
verbs. And nouns and verbs tend to be the most important. Nouns and adjectives tend to operate similarly. And nouns operate in a way that computers can handle. And you
Mm.
can understand this because they're purely representational. So, if you want to have someone remember a tree, you can actually draw a picture of a tree and they'll look at that and say, oh, that's a tree. But then you have a
Yeah.
problem with verbs, which is how do you write down an
Mm.
action? For example, how do you write down growing? Well, you could say, well, I could draw a short tree and then a tall tree. That would be growing, right? But actually, the growing would occur between the two pictures, right? It doesn't actually occur in the pictures. The same thing occurs with any verb, running. You can draw a
Yeah.
picture with legs in one place and legs in another place. And
Mm.
so what that's telling you is that the verb itself is not contained in the representation. It's not contained in the language. It's something that the
Yeah.
human brain has to add to the representation. And that added thing is the narrative. And it's very
Yes.
easy and natural for human brains to do this because we exist in narrative. And in fact,
Yeah.
action is one of the primary functions, I think, of the brain. So it's always adding it without us thinking about it. But this
Yeah.
becomes a problem with, say, computers, because computers can only know the representation. They can
Yes.
only know the representation and they have no experience of action themselves. And as a result, they can't understand narrative because they can't fill in the space between the gaps. And this is one of the primary reasons why LLMs do and will always malfunction, and no matter how much context you give them.
Mm.
And, we know this, and not just from computers. We know this because if you've ever taken a class, or, in English literature, you will know there was a movement called deconstruction or
Mm.
post-structuralism. And these individuals went around the 70s and 80s and proved that you could not use semiotics, you couldn't use language, logic
Mm.
and language to establish definitively the meaning of a text. And they then therefore used this to prove that, text could mean anything. Now, they
Yeah.
were wrong. Text can't mean anything, but they were right that if you try and use logic to understand texts, that it
Yeah.
breaks down. And so these are all just kind of different ways of getting at the same problem, which is that language was never meant to contain narrative.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to contain narrative. And if we try and use these logical techniques to extract narratives or understand narratives from text, we're never going to.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, Angus. I haven't really thought about this. So talk about context. So the U.S. economy today, we were going a little bit on a tangent, but I just want to get your perspective. We have five companies. One of them make the shovels that the California gold rush people use, and that's the highest market cap company today. And the other four are out there. I mean, some of them are paying $250 million for a single human brain to make artificial brain, which is sort of paradoxical in many ways. And so where are we heading on this thing? Are we missing the missing the plot, you think?
Yeah, I think we're catastrophically missing the plot. So I should say that I've been involved in natural language processing for almost a decade now. So I have a fair understanding of LLMs, and I was actually brought in because I'm an expert in narrative to help them solve this problem of narrative. I mean, I was brought in, and that was when I started to realize that they were never going to solve the problem of narrative because it's a hardware issue. You know, it's about logic gates and how logic gates think in equations, and equations, two things have to occur at the same time, and if two things occur,
So sorry to interrupt, Angus. So do you think it's a hardware capacity issue? So what I'm thinking is that suppose I have a company with no resource constraint, and I can create a machine with no constraint in terms of context. So I'm going to feed it an infinite number of something less than infinite number of contexts. And I say, here is a thing, and then you can, sort of iteratively go through the context and pick context number 39 that fits with it. Do you think in a world of infinite resources, you could get there?
No, no, because this is not a data problem. And so let me just restate the way you've said it to make sure I
Yeah.
understand. But basically, what you're saying is imagine you could have an infinite number of computer chips and an infinite number of logic gates, and you could also have, theoretically boundless amount of symbols that you could put into it, each of which were acquired at a particular moment in time. So each of them a particular piece of data, and you fed all that into the machine. Could it somehow, solve this problem that I'm pointing out, which is this
Hmm.
narrative problem? And the answer is no, because it's like saying if you had the world's largest and most powerful toaster, could it ever play a TV show? No, because it's a different machine, right? I mean, and everybody understands this when you start talking about machines, is machines are designed for different things. The problem with AI is we've been led down this rabbit hole thinking that all intelligence is mechanically the same and that it all operates through these and or not operations.
Hmm.
And the reason we know this is not the case is because the human brain can be quite smart with limited information. It's not always smart with limited information, but it can be quite smart with limited information. And
It
that's because
uses only 20 watts
that's right.
to
Yes.
operate.
Right. 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 Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So there's all these ways that human beings can engage in low information intelligence. And so it's not a question of data and things like that. We also know that the human brain evolved computational capacities through our
Hmm.
visual cortex. So our visual cortex is one of the most powerful computers on the planet.
Yeah.
It's incredibly powerful, it handles huge amounts of data, and is very good at synthesizing it into images. But we also know that those mechanisms are not the same mechanisms that drive our motor cortex and our behaviors. It's a totally different, and you can just look at a neuron and see how much more complicated it is than a transistor and the variety of neurons and all these kinds of things. And so what's happening here is computer people are
Hmm.
trying to brute force lots and lots of different mechanical tools
Yeah.
with a single tool. And they just keep saying, if
Hmm.
this one tool becomes more, if this saw becomes more and more powerful, then this saw is going to become a telescope. No, it's not ever going
Hmm.
to become a telescope. It's just become an incredibly powerful saw, right? So
Yeah.
that's the limiting issue here. And I just think there's a kind of failure of understanding about the kind of the biology of intelligence.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about a little bit of biology. So you say here proof has three main components, which I find very elegantly clear. Computer artificial intelligences, including machine learning algorithms, run on the CPU's arithmetic logic unit, which performs all of its computations using symbolic logic.
Yep.
That's number one. Number two, symbolic logic is incapable of causal reasoning. That could be challenged in the future. I don't know. And number three, causal reasoning is required for processing the narrative components of literature. That's very clear, including plot, character, style, and voice. And so the linchpin here, in some sense, symbolic logic is incapable of causal reasoning. Do we have sufficiently robust information on that?
Well, so this is a big argument. I
Yeah.
mean, I personally think we do. I mean, you can look at Bertrand Russell, you can look at David Hume. I mean, all of them have made this a central point. Judea Pearl, the reason the causal calculus exists is a way to try and get around this problem a little bit. But for various reasons we get into, you still really need humans to operate the causal calculus. The machines just allow you to accelerate it and make it more effective. But the key thing to understand here is that computers think in equations. They think
Yeah.
that's the, and that's an equation is a correlation. In an equation, the thing on the left side and the thing on the right side occur at the same moment in time.
Mm.
When you have an action that's a cause and an effect, they do not occur at the same time. That's a definition of a
Right.
cause and effect. And an effect has to occur after a cause. And this is always short-circuited logic. This has always caused problems. And this has led many logicians to deny the existence of causation. That's what Bertrand Russell did, you know. He says,
Mm.
oh, this guy, Hume says, well, we can never be sure about what a cause is, which I think is accurate from a logical perspective, even though I don't think it's true from a biological or scientific perspective, but it's true
Mm.
from the perspective of pure logic. But this has always been the problem. And so, once you accept that a cause and an effect do not, by definition, occur at the same point in time. And
Yeah.
once you accept that, causes and effects are real, then you have this problem. And, computer scientists always try and get around this by
Mm.
arguing, well, you can get to causes from correlations. If you just have enough correlations, you can identify the cause and so on and so forth. And
Mm.
this is totally incorrect because
Yes.
most causes are unseen for a start.
Right.
For example, most of the motivations that go inside other people's heads, Einstein famously said most foundational laws are never actually seen, so it's true that you can hypothesize some causes from correlations, but that's not it's not a perfect mechanism. It's just an ad hoc heuristic that
Mm.
works some of the time.
But I do find so I used to be an engineer, Angus, so I can say this. We have human computers. Let me call them engineers for tactical convenience. Um, they think that way too. It's like, so if I write something on Medium or something that is, crazy stuff about something, no engineers will ever read it because there are no equations in it. I hate equations, by the way. There are no equations in it, but it's some sort of ideas or things that we want to think about. But engineers don't like that, and so maybe we are dividing ourselves into computers and non-computers. In a world of 8 billion people, we can divide humans into computers and non-computers still. And if the non-computers don't survive, we will get one outcome. Uh, if only the computers, if the computers don't survive, we'll get another outcome. So are we heading towards some sort of chaotic process here? I'm just
Uh,
wondering. Yeah.
I think that is a brilliant observation, and I agree with you that many of the my friends who are in computer science think almost exclusively in equations. A couple of things on that, and then I'll answer your big question. The first thing is go back to Michael Faraday. Michael Faraday is the scientist who's responsible for discovering most of the laws of electrodynamics. He didn't know any math. And pretty
He
famous,
made
he
the
actually
bulb.
yes, that's right. And he pretty famously disliked, all these equations, but he was able to do it through a basic scientific process. And it's the same thing. Most really good scientists have capacities like imagination and common sense and things like that, which are not reducible to equations. We could talk about that all day, but I would say that you're right. There's been a turn over the last 50 or 60 years in which everyone has become exclusively mathematical. And as a result of that, people have forgotten that math is about a representation and a simplification. And this is what
Yeah.
Newton did. They've forgotten
And
that it's a
Einstein,
tool.
sorry to interrupt, Angus. I just want to. So Einstein is a classical example of this. He wasn't a great mathematician. He actually just imagined things, and look what that got the humanity to.
He
And
he
yeah,
thought in story. He thought in story. And
yeah,
famously had all these, thought experiments about elevators falling through space. And, what if I rode a bicycle at the speed of light while my headlight was shining and all these kinds of things. And this is actually how he cracked the problem of relativity. Galileo, the same thing. Galileo did all these imaginative thought experiments. And then the math came in later because the math was a way to codify and simplify. But the underlying thought, and the problem with computers is computers can't do that imagination work. They can only do the math. And
mm,
as a result, they can't actually discover fundamental laws. Einstein says this pretty clearly in his lectures on relativity, that you can't actually use math to discover fundamental laws. And so to your point about what's happening, that engineers are becoming more and more, convinced that the world is actually mathematical, right? They've lost the fact
Yeah.
that statistics is a way of representing the world, and they've started to think that the world is statistical. They've started to think that we're living inside a computer simulation, which you can disprove immediately if you think in a narrative, which a computer could not simulate, right? They're thinking this way. And so the question is, what happens if humans get this way? And of course, the real problem is that computers think better that way than we do. So if we start only thinking that way, then we are going to be replaced by computers, and,
Yeah.
and that is dangerous. The upside is that the human brain evolves to do other things which are necessary for survival, which
Mm.
computers can't do. So I think there's going to, at some point, be a realization and a need that there are people like you and me out there, that there are people out there like Faraday and Einstein and all these other kind of fundamental thinkers who need to be part of this computer world.
Right.
My hope is that we start building educational systems that not only help train and empower those individuals,
Yeah.
but I mean, also, value them and stop treating them as they sometimes are nowadays as somehow second-class citizens because they don't think in math.
So that's sort of what you're trying to do at Ohio State, story science, and we'll get to it in the human context. But just as a peripheral observation, um, yeah. So we like I mean, it's a bifurcation here. I mean, we could go down the mathematical route. There will be a world of computers and engineers, or we could go down a well, it's not a non-mathematical route actually. I mean, that's a bad way to think about it, but it is a little different route where you say, yeah, I mean, we don't know everything. I mean, we're going to talk about another paper, the illusion of information adequacy, and so I did some work in economics, and that's also been sort of an interesting uh, linkage to this problem. And so we have social sciences where we don't, so we use actually a lot of mathematics in social sciences nowadays, but we don't really know. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? So I struggle with this in corporations and academics that so we have equations actually. So let me go into it a little bit, get your perspective. So in finance, for instance, we say if you predict cash flows into the future, you can discount those cash flows back to get what we call a net present value. An alternative view of that would be, yeah, you cannot predict cash flows. I mean, the future is uncertain. I mean, if it is so easy, um, it's a different problem. And so we have this happening. I mean, biological life sciences is another area, actually. Life sciences, again, where you have some sort of systematic thought process. You say, metabolic diseases, this is a way to solve it. I have to go XYZ chemical, do that and do this. You say, well, I mean, yeah, we don't really know a lot about it, right? So the fact that we don't know much about it is sort of a big problem, isn't it?
Yeah, and I
Um,
think also we've become increasingly uncomfortable living in the fact that we don't know a lot about things, which is one of the things one of the reasons I'm enjoying having this conversation. I think you acknowledge. So let's talk about this issue and where
yeah.
it comes from. I think a lot of it comes from we were talking about Einstein. He did this brilliant thing when talking about Brownian motion, was he was like, oh, we don't actually have to do all the individual equations. We can just consider it statistically. And we can arrive at
Yeah.
a kind of statistical answer rather than trying to do all, calculate all the different atoms and this kind of thing. And then this became an incredibly powerful tool is to say, well, look, we can manage the complexity of individual atoms across all sorts of domains in chemistry and physics by using statistics instead
Yeah.
of individual equations as Newton would have done. So then what happens is people come along and say, well, these statistics are so good at explaining the behavior of atoms. Let's use them to explain humans. Let's treat humans, right, as atoms, right? And this is where we get all of these kinds of
Yes.
social science ideas and so forth. And
Yeah.
and there's different justifications for this. I mean, one justification is, well, humans are made up of atoms, and so therefore, so and so and so forth. It must make sense that way. Or, I mean, over
Reductionism.
time,
Yeah.
but right, yeah, yeah. Or over time, all the differences cancel out, and so on and so forth. The core problem with this is that in biological systems, unlike in physical or logical systems, you gain an advantage by innovating. So as an individual person, if you can
Hmm.
innovate, what that does is that surprises everyone around you, which, allows you to,
Yeah.
maybe, take advantage of them, beat them at something, so on and so forth, allows you to move faster than them. So the
Hmm.
human brain and most other thinking things evolve to innovate. They evolve to create surprise. They evolve to have this kind of creativity in them, which
Yeah.
actively attempts to disrupt patterns from the past, disrupt logic. So this is
Yeah.
this kind of, this is this thing that's going on. And so
Hmm.
the moment you try to apply statistics to that, it just doesn't work. And we know this going back to, the 19th century.
Right.
There were all these theories from the Enlightenment that you could predict the outcomes of battles in advance, just by
Yeah.
looking at the number of soldiers on each side of the other side. And then people like Clausewitz and whatnot, came along and were like, well, no, that's actually not correct because you have these individual human minds and they are
Right.
unpredictable and they're trying to surprise each other. And even Napoleon can be surprised. So to
Hmm.
your point, it's not just that the universe is uncertain, individual humans are uncertain. Individual
Hmm.
humans don't even know themselves. So it's hard for you and I to say what we're going to do tomorrow,
Hmm.
right? Completely, right? And
Yeah.
so, that's why you can't predict markets because markets are actually not made of money and products and services. They're made of humans, they're made of human choices
Yes.
and actions and things. And so I think it can be useful to use some of these equations in certain cases, but predicting markets is not like predicting the weather. Predicting the weather is hard enough, but predicting markets
Yeah.
is basically impossible because of this human element.
Yeah. That's a very interesting point. So markets, an ego leveling thing for engineers. And you say, I mean, I could write equations, I could have machine learning algorithms, stock is going up or down, and very soon you find that doesn't work. It's a dynamic system primarily driven by future information, not history. So AI today is fundamentally about history. You use all the garbage on the internet uh, to come up with Chat GPT or whatever it's called 5.0 or whatever. And it is just a sort of perpetuating ignorance in many ways. So that has implications. As an educator, I want to ask you this. So it has implications for education. It has implications for general public, right? So suppose I create a technology that is going to eat everything that is there on the internet and regurgitate that as intelligence. And then whatever I put out on the other end of my human structure goes back into the internet. And that will be used again later. Where will this process take us? I mean, it's a pretty scary thought, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's terrifying. I mean, it leads to extreme stupidity. It leads to model collapse. I mean, there's all sorts of ways we could talk about it technically, but it's not good. I mean, so there's a bunch of different problems here. I mean, the first is that the internet, as you say, is full of junk, and so there's just a lot of complete nonsense that's just being fed into it. Also, the internet does not contain all of human experience. So there's a lot of good things that are missing from it.
Hmm.
And so the entire system, even if you trust that computers could somehow take all of experience and then produce, intelligent insights from it, that's not what
Yeah.
it's getting from these systems. It's getting, and many people have talked about this. It's getting a mess, and there's really no way to fix it for a lot of reasons. On top
Hmm.
of that, when we talk about an educational context, learning is an active process. We know this. It's an active process. I mean, this is why, lectures are just less effective than discussions. You're much less likely to remember something that somebody else said than something you yourself said. And so getting
Yeah.
students to talk and participate and have their own ideas, they're going to remember their own thoughts. And the whole idea behind technology now increasingly has been to make life frictionless, to make it
Yeah.
easy. And if you think that education made frictionless is education, it's not. If you have a system, in which the teacher asks a question, which he gets from an AI, and then the student enters the question into the AI, gets an answer, and then gives it back to the teacher, and you think that anything has been accomplished and anyone has learned anything, you're completely wrong. And so obviously these
Hmm.
devices are not very helpful. And I think we're going to see what we saw with social media, which was Silicon
Yeah.
Valley telling us, social media is going to create democracy and it's going to, empower
Hmm.
everybody, and it's going to be wonderful. And then you have a lot of very negative knock-on consequences that weren't anticipated. And the same thing's going to happen if these technologies are put into classrooms too fast without guardrails and people thinking about them.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, this is my opinion. Silicon Valley almost killed democracy.
Yeah.
um, so because
Yes.
that, so
Well,
I
it
want to
certainly
talk a little.
wants to kill democracy. If you talk to a lot of Silicon Valley people, right? I mean, they have this idea that you could have an ultimate intelligence which could make all the right decisions. I mean, this is the same idea that sat at the center of the Soviet Union. They had the Bureau of Statistics. The idea was if you got enough data together, you could have this ultimate enlightened bureaucracy which made all the decisions. And there's nothing wrong with that theoretically. In fact, it sounds great theoretically, but life just
Yeah.
doesn't work that way. And it turns out to be that democracy, as messy as it is, as Winston Churchill said, is our best option.
So I'm just thinking conceptually, Angus. I don't know if I'm thinking about this correctly. So when you have a recycling machine, let me call AI a recycling machine of internet, and it is using its own output in many ways. If you deploy a recycling machine on the social psyche, I think you can probably mathematically show that is not going to lead to a good outcome. It's almost like we are there now. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's not going to lead to a good outcome. I think we are getting closer there. And like I was saying before, the purpose of the human brain is to innovate. The human brain evolved to innovate. And that's because that's what gives you the edge in the fight for life, is the ability to come up with a behavior that is unanticipated, that is new, whether that because that allows you to get to the food faster, whether that's because that allows you to evade a predator. But innovation is the core driver of life. And this is an idea which goes back to William James, goes back to Darwin. I mean, this is something that is rooted in the history of modern science, modern psychology, modern biology. And to
Hmm.
your point, the entire purpose of these machines is this pattern matching and to identify stronger and stronger patterns, which it then repeats. And the
Yeah,
purpose of human intelligence is to break patterns and disrupt patterns,
yeah, yeah.
And so if all of a sudden you replace human intelligence with this thing, you're going
Right.
to get away at the origin of human survival and biological success.
Hmm. So before we go into the human things, and because I want to ask you a sort of peripheral question. So suppose we have, it's a thought experiment, an island where we deploy many different AIs, many different types of AIs, and we let them evolve by competition. Do you think we'll get to a more interesting outcome? I mean,
No.
in other words, what I'm saying is that did evolution make a big difference to biological systems that we don't have in silicon-based systems?
Oh, I see. Well, look, evolution does make a big difference in biological systems, but you have to understand, the purpose of logic, why it was invented, and its function is to establish truth. Truth is eternal and absolute. There is one truth. One plus
Yeah.
one always equals two and will always equal two. And so the entire purpose of that mechanism is not to produce a kind of branching diversity of alternative life forms. It's to arrive at the eternal, the unchanging, the perfect. And so this idea that you're having this kind of competition between AI systems, really what you're talking about there on a technical level is that they might have different weights, they might value different data more than something else, so on and so forth, But the reality is all of them are trying to do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Biological organisms are not trying to do the same thing. They're trying to do different things. That's why when you walk into a forest, there are different kinds of tree, each of
Mm.
them trying to live in a different way. Their ecologies are different. You go around the world, there are different types of animals
Mm.
that have specialized for different environments. And so the big thing here is that from the perspective of biology, what you're trying to do is grow. That's the
Yeah.
core purpose of biology is growth, not truth, growth. And growth and truth
Mm.
operate mechanically differently. And so while evolution works for things that are growing, it's not going to help you with computers. I mean, what's going to help you with computers is human engineers who purify the data and who tune the weights appropriately, for the outcome. I mean, as you know this, I mean, the way that an AI learns is it hitting its targets. You
Yeah.
set these targets. It doesn't operate as humans do in an unconstrained space where, Van Gogh, right, wasn't competing to hit a specific target. He was innovating art. Shakespeare wasn't trying to hit a specific target. He was innovating literature. And so it's just a totally different model of life. And it doesn't mean that AI is bad. It just means that it's not everything.
It's a different thing. So I remember you talking about this. So biological neurons, um, our basic template is that, it goes in sort of one directional, and then the errors are back propagated. I was floored when somebody got a Nobel Prize in statistical physics. I didn't know such a thing existed, actually. Um, but the brain doesn't work like that, right? It's like, yeah, it's making a lot of random firings and a lot of random mistakes. It's almost empirical in some ways. It is not programmatic. Um, and so, I mean, humans are incapable of thinking about that, actually. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm making a overreaching statement here. Maybe what we should do in deep neural networks is to keep introducing errors into it. Maybe it will get better. I don't know.
So there are two separate things you're talking about in terms of the
Yeah.
human brain and what makes it different. First is this question of programming, which you're right. I mean, what the human brain is constantly doing is it's constantly initiating new actions and
Yeah.
specifically initiating new action sequences. A new action sequence is a new sequence of behaviors. It's saying, I'm going to move my arm a different way or different, and then it's testing those through feedback and determining which work. I mean, this was the basis of a field which I know you know about called cybernetics, which is kind of an early AI kind of spin-off. So there's that whole thing. But then there's the other thing, which you're talking about, which is that the brain evolved to think in action. It did not evolve to think in equations. This is something that is fundamentally misunderstood nowadays. People think that neurons are on or off, and therefore, this, that, and the other thing. Or sometimes they think, oh, well, maybe they're thinking in kind of fuzzy, analog. No. What a neuron is thinking is A leads to B leads to C. And the reason it's thinking that way is that's how life works. Life works as, I go over here, I catch that thing, and I put it in my mouth. So this action, followed by this action, followed by this action.
I go to a water hole and the tiger eats me. I mean, after that, it's
Right.
nothing. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. That's a failed action. That's a failed experiment. That brain didn't live on, right? You know what I mean? A different brain with a different, way of thinking. And so a sequence of actions is a narrative, is a plot, is a plan. And so, the brain evolved to think in stories because it evolved to make plans. And the thing about plans is a plan is a series of possible actions as opposed to a series of probable actions. It's a series of possible actions. It's actions that have never been tried before, but which do not contradict the laws of your environment that you are going to try to see if they give you an edge or an advantage. And this goes down to the functioning of the neuron. As you've indicated, there was a period of time in the mid 20th century when a group of scientists known as the Sparks thought that neurons communicated largely electronically. So they thought that basically a spark would leap the gap between one neuron and the other. That the synapse was basically, punctuated by these little lightning bolts going back and forth. And if that were the case, then essentially the human brain would be operating like a computer. And it would be thinking in equations, because you would be having, these equilibrium of charges, and you'd be having a continuous, electronic design in the brain. And what was discovered instead by John Eccles, who's this kind of brilliant scientist who was a spark, but then had a conversion when he realized that his experiment didn't work, is that actually, neurotransmitters, which are made of chemicals and proteins and other kinds of things, are actually what go across the gap. And what that means is you have physical connections, which are different from electronic connections, because physical connections don't need to obey the laws of electronic design. It allows for improvised action sequences as opposed to algorithms. So it's a completely different kind of mechanism, a different form of behaving. And it means that you can imagine I'm going to do all these things that I've never done before. You can play that simulation in your head, and then you can go try it in the real world and see if it works before. So these are just fundamentally different mechanical instruments. Neurons are than transistors, and they just do different things.
Yes, as I'm thinking, Angus, that the reason nature invented an electrochemical magnetic system is that it had reasons to do so. And it is not truly prescriptive, mathematical, deterministic, anything like that. with that brain, we invented computers, and computers are truly deterministic, predictive. Um, and it's just a tool. It is not intelligence. So uh, this is what keeps me awake at night.
Yes.
There
Well,
is
this
so
is
many people who think this is going to go into the general artificial intelligence, the artificial general intelligence, AGI, and I don't even see intelligence to start with. So, so how do you get there?
Well, I agree with you. I agree that these are automated systems, and I agree that this is not AI, this is IA. We are totally agreed on this front. And I also agree that, this is like if you were to go back to a certain period of time and people had never seen a handgun before or a firearm or a musket, and you walked into their society and you fire this handgun, and they said, "Oh my goodness, it's magic, right? This person who can kill things at a distance probably has the power to do all sorts of things. He can turn himself into a lizard or a dragon. And so what happens
Right.
is you see a machine do something incredible, which I think
That's
LLMs
right.
are doing something incredible. I mean,
Yeah,
I
that's a
think
good
it's
analogy. That's a good, really
astonishing.
good analogy. Yeah,
But that doesn't mean that because they can do one astonishing thing that they can do everything. I mean, this is the error
right.
known as magical thinking, right? Where you jump from a specific cause and an effect into generalities in which one cause causes every effect, like the
Mhm.
philosopher's stone or something like that. So yeah, so I think that's kind of where we are. And I think we're also here because, for over a century, people have had this idea that intelligence can be reduced to a single function, IQ tests, all these kinds of things. And we just know this, that people who score very, very high on IQ tests don't necessarily make the most sensible people, right? I mean, there are obviously different kinds of intelligence operating in the
Now
world.
you tell
And
me. Just kidding. I'm
well,
just
I
kidding.
mean, I should say, I mean, this is something, I mean, one of the things people often think is, well, Angus, you're railing against computers and math because you must be bad at computers and math. And actually, I'm very gifted at computers and math. That's kind of my edge over 99% of the population. I'm definitely not good enough to be a kind of elite AI programmer, but, on standardized tests and all that kind of stuff, I always score on the 1% of 1% for math and everything. And that made me realize that math isn't actually that useful in real life because I was
Yeah.
constantly losing in real life to people who scored very badly on these tests,
Yes.
but who were smart in other ways.
So you want to talk about humans? I know that I don't know how relevant they are anymore, but it could be sort of interesting. So you say here improving creative thinking through narrative practice. And I know that you have done a lot of work in this area. So military leaders must must pose subordinate leaders to predict future states by appreciating clues presented in environments. Leaders must predict what will happen next. Such prediction requires acute creative thinking skills. Army leaders plan for future operations using military planning processes, including the military decision making process. And these processes entail a means of developing courses of action, testing those courses of action for viability, and publishing an order directing subordinate units to execute the selective course of action. So, yeah, so I know nothing about this, Angus. So, I mean, we have a very, very complex system in the military, a lot of data coming in from various sources. I would imagine data has a lot of uncertainty. There's a hierarchy there in terms of decision processes. Um, and so what did you learn from your sort of interactions with the U.S. military?
Well, I learned a lot. So, first of all, just to be honest, I did not think of the Army as a place of intelligence before I started working with them. I don't have a background in the Army. When I was contacted by the Army, I mean, when I was going in high school, you went into the Army if you couldn't get into college. I mean, that was the kind of community that I grew up in. So I didn't think of the Army as a place where you would go to study intelligence. And I was disproven. I was recruited to work with a series of classified units in U.S. Army Special Operations, where we started kind of dealing with this hard problem of how certain people act very intelligently in very uncertain environments.
Hmm.
And we dealt with that on the level of individual operators to start with. And then we started looking at commanders and other individuals. And the reason that military environments are so uncertain is because you're confronted with an adversary who's attempting, first of all, to conceal everything about themselves, to send
Yeah.
out misinformation, disinformation, all these kinds of things. And that adversary is also trying to destroy the operating environment and destroy the things that you are good at. So you're in this very, very volatile situation. It's called VUCA by the Army: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity.
Yeah.
And yet, certain individuals outperform other individuals very consistently in these environments. And so
Mm.
the Army basically wanted me to study what those individuals were doing. Why were these individuals, and then how can we kind of train the other individuals to get up there? And over the course of this work, what we found out was that you could train almost anyone to improve. Not everyone
Mm.
became as good as the best, but everyone improved.
They could
And what
improve. Yeah. Okay.
they could improve. And the people who were the best were doing things that were consistent with other people who were the best. Like there was a core
Mm.
set of things. And the Army likes to call that variously things like creative thinking or strategic thinking and things like that. But basically, in narrative terms, what's happening is two processes.
Yeah.
Diversifying causal thinking. So that means coming up
Mm.
with multiple explanations for why something happened, and sharpening counterfactual thinking. And what that means is if I change one thing, what's the
Yeah.
smallest thing that I can change? And then how far can I imagine the consequences of that change into the future? Being very,
Yeah.
very specific. Um,
Yeah. So this is what going back to our previous discussion. This is sort of the action cause and effect issue,
yes,
right? Yeah.
yes, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. Because basically what you're saying is, so one of the things that people don't understand about story, which they often find interesting, is that when you're in school, you're taught that stories go from beginning to middle to end.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, right? Logically, that's what you would think, right? But in the human brain, story evolved to go middle to beginning to end. And the
Mm.
reason for that is the human brain evolved to sit around not doing much, right? Just kind of, doing whatever it was
Mm.
doing until something surprised it. And then when
Yeah.
something surprised it, it realized, oh, God, I better change, right? I got to do something. And so that surprise is the middle. And what you realize is that you've walked into the middle of a story that you don't understand. Maybe the middle of the
Mm.
story is a predator who you didn't anticipate. Maybe it's someone in your family behaving in a way you didn't anticipate. Maybe it's a new technology, right? But you've arrived in the middle of a story. And then what your
Yeah.
brain does in that moment is it says, okay, I've got to go back to the beginning of the story because I've got to figure out how we got here.
Mm.
And then in order to survive, I've got to accelerate to the end so I can go faster and beat other people to the end. And so that going back to the beginning from middle to beginning, that's known as causal thinking.
Yeah.
And you get better at that if you can come up with multiple causes as opposed to just one. People who are poor causal thinkers always go back to the same cause. So you see this in politics, right? I don't want to call out any specific politicians, but politicians are always blaming the same thing for every problem, right? If you're on the left, you always blame the right for your problems. If you're on the right, you always blame the left for your problems, right? It's always the same problems, right? Whereas if you're an engineer, you've got to be able to come up with multiple possible causes for everything because
Mm.
that's stretching your range of experiment. And then in terms of counterfactual thinking, that's the jump from beginning to end. You've got to be very, very precise. You've got to
Mm.
be able to see every single step and see all those consequences. And people who are effective planners are very, very good at being very detailed in those ways. Again, as an engineer, you don't just sit down and say, well, I'm going to build an airplane. How are you going to do that? Well, I'm just going
Mm.
to build an airplane. You say, well, there's all these different subparts, and then these subparts
Mm.
connect in these ways, and then, this subpart is manufactured in this way, and so on and so forth. And you're able to break it down very precisely. And so those skills of jumping from middle to beginning, that's the skill of
Mm.
science. That's what allows you to discover fundamental laws. And then to discover from beginning to end, that's engineering, that's technology. That's the ability
Yeah.
to make things once you've discovered those fundamental laws.
Yeah. So my brain is going a lot of different directions, Angus. I don't know where to go, but um, so we could divide ourselves into engineers and scientists, and that includes social science also. Um, and politicians, I don't know where they where they fit in here, but uh, scientists always say, yeah, I mean, scientists deal with uncertainty all the time. And they always say, show me the data and let me look at it and let me create a hypothesis and me test it. Engineers have Isaac Newton's equations, and that has shown to be true. There is really no need for any sort of questioning um, Newton's equations. And so, if you're in a world of certainty, your brain develops in certain way, right? And if you're a world of in a world of uncertainty, your brain develops. So going back to the education question, so are we? I mean, I would argue computers can do most of engineering today. I mean, if anything can be reducible to equations, feed it to a silicon machine, and it'll do so much better than humans. And so are we sort of delayed on this transition in some way? You know what I mean? Yeah.
I do, yeah. So what you're basically saying is that if we live in a world of total certainty, there's really no need for new science because we know everything. And, engineering can be done better by computers because they can apply what we know better than we can. So if you believe that we are in a world of total certainty where nothing is going to change, then absolutely humans are a big problem, and we are stopping the science and the computers from working. The reality, however, is that we are in a world of tremendous uncertainty. We've seen this repeatedly over the last few years.
Yeah.
And what that means is that actually science is not complete. There's a lot that we don't know. And so that's why we need humans to engage in these narrative processes. And what we also know is that if there's going to be new science, then there's going to need to be new engineering, and engineers are going to have to test things. So, sort of a famous example of this is at the end of the 19th century. The world's most famous statistician was Lord Kelvin. And
Yeah.
Lord Kelvin, having satisfied himself that Darwin was wrong, he disproved Darwinism. He then went out and proved that it was impossible for humans to fly. He said there will never be an airplane. He stated this in 1895, and then he restated it in 1902. And of course, famously, what happened in 1903 is the Wright brothers flew. And that was because Lord Kelvin believed that the laws of science, in terms of the laws of thermodynamics, which he'd been involved
Mm.
in driving, were all of science. And he didn't
Yeah.
believe that they would come, Marie Curie. He didn't believe any of these things would come. And so he thought science was done, and therefore everything that could exist had existed already. If you're Lord Kelvin, if you believe that we have uncovered the fundamental laws of life and they are and or not or and nor or whatever else you want to call the logic of computer gates, if you believe
Yeah.
that those are the laws of life and we know all that, then there's no need for humans anymore. If, however, you think it's possible, just looking at the amount of uncertainty and volatility and mystery in the world, that
Yeah.
there's a lot more for us to discover. We don't know very much about how the brain works, let alone how many other things work. So my sense is that yes,
Mhm.
when we get to a future in which science knows everything, yes, we can trust the computers to build utopia for us. But until that moment, humans are going to be necessary to be kept in the loop.
Yeah. I used to say, Angus, that God has a sense of humor. She leads you to a, a point that you think you know something,
Yes.
and then she completely drops you. I mean, this is a process that we've been going through for thousands of years, and I think it'll continue. And so I want to end up with kids. So you say here narrative creativity training, a new method for increasing resilience in elementary students. It's very interesting, Angus. So narrative creativity training has recently shown promise as a tool for increasing self-efficacy and resilience in adult learners. The training employs dramatic and literary techniques such as perspective shifting, counterfactual thinking, and causal thinking to reveal real world problem solving. To explore whether narrative creativity training could have similar benefits for younger populations, this study piloted a test on elementary students. So, yeah, talk a little bit about this test. So, what did you find?
So it started with the observation that students today are suffering from very high levels of anxiety, anger, and submissiveness, dependence. They just ask adults for help an enormous amount. And to the point about what we were talking about earlier, this is because humans actually don't do well in environments where there's too much certainty. And
Yeah.
schools have become places where everything is certain, because everything is about standardized tests and math. And so there's an answer for everything. And so when you put these young minds into a world where everything is known,
Mm.
this kind of artificial environment, it teaches them that there's an answer and the teacher has it. And what that then leads
Yeah.
them to believe is that if they don't have the answer, right, they better ask for it or they're going to give up or get angry or aggressive. And it essentially stimulates a threat response in the brain. And so
Yeah.
what we start to do is say, okay, well, this is not healthy for children for all sorts of reasons. First of all, it's just not healthy in terms of their time in school, but also when they get outside of school and they encounter uncertainty, they're not
Mm.
prepared to deal with it, right? They've actually been alienated from the things that they're good at in school, because they've been treated like computers. And so What we did
Yeah.
is we started to train students in the same methods that we use for U.S. Army special operators, and we
Yeah.
trained them, as you said, in causal and counterfactual thinking. Those, thinking from in story from middle to beginning and beginning to end, and all these kinds of things. And we also gave them open-ended, complicated problems, including problems from their own lives.
Yeah.
Problems that did not have a right answer because they were
Hmm.
human problems. What do you do
Hmm.
when your friends make fun of you for your bathing suit or something like that? What do you do, right? There's no right answer to that. And we
Exactly.
so we gave them this training in narrative thinking, a
Hmm.
lot of which is rooted in theater and in literature and
Hmm.
other forms of culture, which are there to kind of pass on what you might think of as wisdom as opposed to
Hmm.
knowledge. They're there to pass on this human ability to have things like imagination and common sense as opposed to logical certainty.
Hmm.
And what we found was, not surprisingly, that
Hmm.
when kids were given this, they became better at making plans.
Yeah.
Because that's really the key, as we've been talking about over this conversation, is a plan is a new series of actions for dealing with a new situation you haven't seen before. They became better at making plans. The better they got at making plans, the less flustered they were when things didn't go the way they expected because they just made another plan. They didn't give up or ask for help. And so that's
Yeah.
why we saw these increases in resilience and self-efficacy. It was a byproduct of the fact that the students got better at making plans.
Yeah. This is beautiful, Angus. I mean, you are sort of in a unique position, philosophy, literature, and science. And I think it's my firm belief is that it's the intersections of disciplines where we find interesting, interesting things. And so societally, the question will be a larger question will be for you, how do we push? I mean, these are elementary students. How do we push students into the boundaries? So I think Finland, one of the leading educational countries in the world, they have recently said, yeah, there is no physics 101 or chemistry 102 anymore. You guys figure out what you want to learn, and then we'll provide that for you. Um, I think in the US we are too prescriptive. I think we are too stringent. Um, and I think it's going to come back and bite us in the future. What do you think?
I think so too. And I think the irony is the entire point of America is it's supposed to be a country that nourishes individuality and freedom and democracy. So I'm an immigrant to this country. I was not born here. And I came here because of a sense of freedom and a chance to do something different. And I think we created a school system very paradoxically, which is like squeezing that out. And I have to be honest, I'm not an expert on systems. I'm not an expert on schools or societies or anything like that. Like any professor, I'm an expert on one tiny, tiny, tiny thing. And I'm an expert on how individual brains process narrative. I mean, that's kind of the one thing that I'm good at. But we are trying here at Ohio State, actually largely as a result of the rise of AI. I've been invited by our business school to help with the redesign of our core curriculum to
Mm,
start
mm.
and adding in these experiential learning processes, like the ones we were talking about for elementary
Yeah, yeah.
students, to help students kind of develop this ability to make plans. And I think what you're going to start to see is that more people are going to realize that they need these skills and there's going to be a call for them. And, the main reason that the system exists now, frankly, is because students that are in it can't resist it because they're put in it young.
Mm.
And parents have a series of unfortunate tendencies to reinforce the system because they want their kids to do well and be regarded as having good grades and so on and so forth. And so they, when their students don't do well in the system, they blame their own kids and say work harder, and you need to study harder and so on and so forth, as opposed to saying maybe we could come up with a better system. But I think we're starting to get
Yeah.
to a point in America, to your point, where maybe this is going to change.
Yeah. So I just hope AI is not going to eliminate humanity as one of the Nobel laureates predicted in 5 years. Hopefully. Excellent. Excellent, Angus. Yeah. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thank you. This has been a beautiful conversation. I really appreciate how seriously you've taken my research and how deep a conversation we have. And hopefully, I write another book in a few years and I can appear again.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, come back. Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Thank you.